everyone. Welcome to an all new episode of the Indic Explorer Show. Please don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe to the channel. Your support means a lot to us. Now, there has always been a discussion in the mainstream media about liberalism and nationalism, and this conversation happens both in the Indian perspective as well as in the global and the Western perspective. And mostly these ideologies are clashing with each other in the social sense, in the political realm, in the intellectual sphere as well, and the academic sphere as well. But today, I want to look at both of these ideologies with a slightly different prism. The idea of this conversation is to kind of try to figure out if there can be a common meeting ground for both of them to access each other. They are obviously not the same and they will have opposing views. But can they at least, in some respects, find a ground where they can meet and try to reconcile some differences and at least be accessible? That's the whole point. Because if both sides remain in echo chambers, then it's not going to help either one of them. So, with that kind of end in mind, I have a very interesting and special guest with me today, Anwesh Satpathy. Welcome to the show, Anvesh. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
Great. So, before we start, why don't you give a very small, brief introduction about yourself and from the perspective of why you can bring a very interesting perspective on this.
Okay, so just a bit about my name. You pronounce it Satpathy. The correct pronunciation is Satpathy. So it comes from like Satapatha Brahmana. Like that's where it comes from. So Satpathy. But so why about me? I am a student currently of political science bachelor's at based in Sonipat General Global University, and I'm also a writer. I write constantly on various news outlets and magazines, and I am quite active on social media, and I also have a YouTube channel. So I think why I'm the right person to do this. I don't know, frankly, because you will have to tell me that because since you invited me. But I have some opinions on this topic that I think might be helpful as a conversation starter for your viewers. So I think, yeah, that's why I think it would be fun to have this
So
conversation.
yeah, full disclosure, like obviously you lean on the liberal side, so you bring that
Yeah.
lens in mind. So I
Left. I don't mind being called
okay,
left.
left liberal, right? So you lean on that side. So, but I've read your articles, and even if I might have a differing point of view, I believe that you put together a very cogent argument and build a hypothesis. So I felt like it's possible to have that conversation with you on this, and also you're a student of social science as well. So there is that perspective also that is required when you kind of broach into this subject. So, anyways, let's start on the topic. So, what is the history of the trajectory of these two ideologies and their interplay? Where does it start? And I believe at some point, because when I was reading quite a bit about this, at some point, liberalism and nationalism, many viewers might find this surprising, were actually the same thing. Like they were almost like, when I say the same thing, those two ideas actually met in the same side. Yeah, talk a little bit about the history of this.
So the history of the concept of liberalism as such goes back obviously to the Enlightenment thinkers, uh, John Locke, Rousseau, Mills, uh, post-Enlightenment and post-Enlightenment there's Mills, Kant, all of these thinkers. So liberalism, if I have to summarize it, because to get the salient points, because it's a lot of things, the salient point of liberalism would be that the individual is paramount. So the early thinkers of liberalism, Hume, Kant, Rousseau, they were interested in first defending individuals, so their starting point was individual rights. And second, they were also interested in defending the idea of the state, a state that has legitimacy from individuals. And that is the entire question that Locke grapples with his entire life: the defense of a state. How can state and individual rights be reconciled? And the way they decided to do this was through social contract theory. Although, strictly speaking, Kant would probably not be an absolute social contract theorist in that sense, but those are minor differences. In the broader sense of the term, the argument was that individuals have rights, and because those rights need to be protected, there needs to be a state. And the legitimacy of that state arrives from social contract between individuals who have differing conceptions of the common good. And this will again come to mind when we talk about nationalism. So this was the first phase of sort of liberalism. At this point, nationalism is not in scene, and frankly, all of these thinkers are not concerned about defending or defining or talking about it in any sense of the term. So they're not even thinking about reconciliation of ideas. It comes into the scene when, in the 19th century, with the reunification of Italy with Mazzini and Garibaldi, and all of these thinkers who are nationalist. Mazzini founded the Young Italy. He was an Italian revolutionary who inspired Savarkar. He was a nationalist, as and he was a liberal. So it is at this point that these questions become sort of intertwined. Can there be a reconciliation between the two ideas? That question, I think, comes into vogue at this point. So nationalism is defined by the likes of Mills and then Isaiah Berlin much later on as a sort of group. It's a sort of tribal concept where we are social beings, so we need to belong to a group. And that group, the primary group that we belong to, is the nation, is the primary group after family, as many nationalist thinkers would argue. So the reconciliation of uh, nationalism and liberalism at this point, I think, is unsuccessful, because liberalism is defined by its value pluralism. What Berlin calls value pluralism, which is to say that people have differing conception of the common good, and we need the state to ensure that those different conceptions of the common good are resolved out. So but the state has to be minimal. The state cannot have an overbearing uh, influence on the individual's life. And because of that, the state cannot promote a certain group over the other. And that would be the conflict, the central conflict between nationalism and liberalism.
If you look at it, even the 1848 revolutions, which are called as the liberal nationalist revolutions, right? They happen across countries. It happens in France, but largely in Germany, because the German people are divided across different kingdoms, and they all want to kind of overthrow the monarchy, the liberals in different German-speaking areas of Europe, and they want to establish a German-speaking liberal democratic state. Like, so they do have some cultural roots in the sense that you speak a common language, but again, like you said, it failed in some ways, right? And which is why what I'm not able to understand, because this is my personal view and it's speculative history. Had the 1848 revolution succeeded, we probably may not have had the world wars, because the German nation would have formed in a democratic fashion already. The need for those world wars in some ways would probably not have happened. What do you think about that?
I think it's an interesting counterpoint, but you have to also acknowledge that at this point there are other tribal ideologies going around. So I talked about Mills. So Mills, when he talks about nationalism, he basically imagines it as a sort of, he calls it the community of recollections, which is strikingly similar to Benedict Anderson's imagined community. So for Mills, that is what nationalism is at the core. But at the same time, the nationalism of Mills is not even, it is restricted. So he thinks that some groups, it's okay for some groups to lord over the others. So for instance, he thinks that the British colonialism and education would be a net good on India, or for instance Scotland. So all of these issues, so Mills thinks that some groups can be nationalistic but other groups cannot be nationalistic. So there is an inherent contradiction in Mills, even when he tries to reconcile his liberal philosophy with nationalism, plus the context of the times that are gaining traction. And this, again, when we talk about national this debate in the context of India, I think an essential figure that is often ignored is Nietzsche and his influence on Iqbal, because all of these figures, Iqbal, Tagore, and Gandhi, all of them were deeply involved in this debate because they were centrally defending nationalism.
Okay, so so you basically are saying that since they could not be reconciled, it didn't succeed, and that's where the separation happens, probably in the late 19th century, right?
Well, I don't know if there was ever a reconciliation historically. So I don't know if because I think Mazzini reconciled it well. I think he was pretty strong on his liberalism as well as nationalism. So he was a nationalist liberal. But after that, we know what happened in Italy. We know the fascists took over century or so after Mazzini, perhaps not even a century. So I don't know how successful this endeavor was at all.
You might find this information interesting. There's this group called, I think they're called the 49ers.
Hmm.
They were the German liberals after the loss during the revolution, when the kingdoms won, the monarchy won over the liberals in Germany and different parts of Austria. Many of them immigrated to the United States, and they formed a core for the Union against the Confederacy. Many of them. They were actually on the side of the Union, and they all fought on the side of the Union because they, in a way, they found the values of the North very similar to. And I'm not saying they're descendants, the migrants themselves in their own lifetime came and they were part of the North struggle, the war with the Confederates. So that's a very interesting,
Interestingly, an early attempt at the reconciliation of liberalism and nationalism was made by Lord Acton. So Acton says that the values of the majority should not impede on the values of the minority. So in other words, he's defending a federal structure and advocating for a liberal nationalism. In fact, that is the reason he gives for supporting the Confederacy versus the North, because he argues that the North is trying to impose his values on the Confederacy, and that is why he supports that. So it's a twisted claim, but it's an yearly attempt, and Mills actually takes inspiration from some of Lord Acton's writings explicitly when he's writing about the same topic later on.
now the problem here is that when you bring majority and minority, number one,
Hmm.
the very basic fundamental of liberalism, of individualism, of classical
Yeah,
liberalism,
yeah.
right, that is gone. Because when you create collectives, whether majority, minority, it undermines.
Nationality is a collective. This has to be a reconciliation in that way. You have to acknowledge the existence of social groups, otherwise, it's not going to be any reconciliation.
Now, see, the reconciliation can only be one angle that I can see is that individual rights and the nation as a community, rather than different parts or sections. Like the nation itself is one imagined community, right? In a way,
Hmm,
like it's
hmm.
just people coming together and saying we are a country at a very base level, right? So that is the community, and the individual is a member of the community. So, can that not work as a reconciliation? Does the division of the people or the members of that community into sub communities and then I mean, isn't that a better way or a different way of looking at this?
So I think that is civic nationalism, and that is the de facto way in which most nations are run. The movement a significant majority, a significant portion of the population ceases to think of themselves as members of that nation, they split away. This is exactly what happened with the post Soviet nations. They just stopped thinking of themselves as being part of that union. They stopped thinking themselves of being part of that country. On the other hand, there are also many nationalities which develop over a very short period of time. Taiwan is a great example.
Yeah.
They were the same people as the Chinese not that long ago. In a span of a few decades, they developed the feeling that they're separate, and now most Taiwanese think of themselves as Taiwanese and not Chinese. So it has to do with the people. Like, it is an imagined community at its essence, and the movement, the people, let's call it an imagined fiction, as it were. Like Harari, Yuval Noah Harari calls it, the movement people stop thinking of it as a legal fiction, then it ceases to exist.
Now, the other issue here is in a liberal democracy, because those words are used together more often than not. Democracy is, by its definition, the rule of the majority over the
Yes.
whole set of people, right? It's not just over the minority, but also over the whole country. A majority, whatever that majority constitutes by direct vote, becomes the ruling or the deciding factor to run a country. So, in that sense, a liberal democracy is an oxymoron.
Sure, it is, but we have to consider if a democratic state is legitimate or not, and that is an entirely different question. I would argue that democracy is not imposing the will of the majority over the minorities. It is a way of choosing the government, but we need to have institutions. Like, a liberal democracy will have institutions to ensure that the rights and the views of the minority is protected uh, under the constitutional and cultural rights, and they have as much of a say in forming their own communities as the majority communities, and it's the responsibility of the state to protect them.
Okay. Now, it's important to talk about this because the post Westphalian era, I mean, the way nation states are imagined. Previously, monarchies were the unit of governance, the central unit of governance. So, the conception of a monarchy is where the personhood of the clan or the bloodline or the ruler, the king, the crown, is what defines it's defined to a person. The problem with that is that if the person goes and a new person comes in that line, but is not good enough, then the whole thing collapses. So I believe that is one. So it becomes person dependent. But in a nation state, one very interesting way, and this is a self defined, is that what I consider a nation state is a kind of a country which can replicate itself irrespective of the type of governance, whether it's a, I mean, in a way you can say even a dictatorial state is a nation state, right? Because a dictator, I mean, even if it's a dictator, But if it's associated with a country with a certain defined border, it doesn't depend on the dictator. Tomorrow, a democracy can come and the same nation state continues. So, in that way, a nation state probably is more of a concept which can replicate itself through different ruling forms, through different types of governments. What do you think about that?
I think it's an interesting way to look, but I also think that there are states which don't necessarily have nations. I am not sure whether Russia, for instance, Soviet Union is a more explicit example, whether they were nation states or just states with multiple nationalities. The Soviet Union
Confederation.
was clearly, yeah, it was clearly a confederation. It was clearly one state with multiple nationalities, with varying degrees of autonomous granted to various states. So there can be states without nations. There can be
Nations without state?
nations. Yeah, there can be nations without states also. So, in that sense, nation state is the most prevalent form of government that we have at this movement in history. It doesn't have to be that way, and
Really?
we well, it's a question of history. I don't know whether it was going to work out in the future or not. That is a question that has to have it has normative components to it, and I don't like. I will have to tell you my opinion on it. So I don't know what is going to happen historically. Like nobody could have predicted, for instance, that the fascists were going to come in Germany when the Weimar Republic was at its peak before the First World War. I don't think that we could have predicted that. So in that sense of the term, a nation state is right now the winner, in the sense that it seems to be the most stable way of formulating a community. It's a more stable structure that we have. Uh, so I think going forward, these are the questions that we'll have to answer. We'll probably face this question when we're faced with more such questions of ethnic nationalities, which pose a danger, which are a dangerous component of the nation state, where the ethnic becomes the defining category by which the entire state is defined, and
Yeah.
we don't want to do that if we are going to reconcile liberalism with nationalism.
We will come to that, but before that, I there's another interesting conception of a nation, which is the net of a state, which is a network state of Balaji Srinivasan. Like which looks at the digital sphere as a way to kind of create communities, and then around them, nations, not nations, actually states will be formed around certain like-minded interests and coming. I mean, again, I am talking at it at a very base level. It's a very complicated concept. But coming to this topic that you mentioned about ethnicity defining nation, right? So before that, I want to ask you whether, because the other viewpoint is a constitution defining a nation, constitutional patriotism जो बोलते हैं, right?
You're cutting off. Can you
Yeah, I'm
repeat?
saying constitution defining a nation, जिसको constitutional patriotism बोलते हैं. Like, that's the other
Yeah,
viewpoint against this ethnicity defining a nation, which is that a book with common defined rules by elected legislators,
yeah.
is what binds the nation. Now, my question here is, because a nation, and you spoke about the anthropologist who spoke about, I forgot his name, but who talks about Afghans and how they feel that they are a nation, right? In the sense that there are Pashtuns in Pakistan and in Afghanistan, there are Tajaks in Afghanistan and Tajikistan, there are Uzbeks in Uzbekistan and Afghanistan, but yet these groups in Afghanistan don't relate with those groups. They think of themselves as a nation. This doesn't fit with the post-Yugoslav, nation state definition that each, like, So here my question is whether it is cultural ethnicity, shared values versus a constitution. Can a book, like, I know that it's a very rational way of looking at it, but can a book really give a meaningful national identity compared to something that is not that rational, but it's cultural or a little more, like, something that impacts people's lives at a deeper level? What do you think about this?
The short answer to that is no. Obviously, a book can't do that, and it has not done that. And we know this because even the people who preach constitutional nationalism in India, I don't know. I mean, some of them might be Congress supporters and people like that. Uh, they don't really believe that this is what's happening. If they really believed that, we were nationalist people, believed in the Indian nation because there is one constitution, they wouldn't focus so much on history. They wouldn't focus so much on the freedom movement. They wouldn't focus so much on crafting certain heroes or certain villains. So they know that the nation, any nation, needs a narrative. And that narrative does not come from the constitution. The constitution may reflect the narrative that already exists. It may reflect a compromise that all these groups, and our constitution is essentially a compromise. It's a very good compromise. So it can reflect that compromise, but it cannot form the basis of nation for people below, for the farmer, for the student. So because we teach our students, what their nation is, and when we do that, we tell them about its history, we tell them about the heroes, we tell them about certain values which may be enshrined in constitution, but we don't always say that these are values that are in constitution. We go back to mythological stories, we go back to history. Why? Because there is a deep seated need within every human beings to believe that these values are eternal, that these values have always existed, that these are not just new. Our freedom fighters recognize that from all sides. Nehru recognized it as much as Tilak did. So, all from all sides of the political spectrum, they recognize the fact that simply constitutional nationalism is not going to lead to national citizens.
Many people say it's like a second coming of paganism, the civic religion. Like, if you see, in the pagan era, the deities were linked to the cities, right? And there was, so in a way, it was, you could say, a mythos of the city. And in that sense, whether it's the legislature, whether it's your national heroes, they also form what would you call a national cosmology of sorts, in that sense. So you are kind of creating a narrative that, how I would look at it is, it's like change with continuity. And that's a very Indian way of doing things, right? Like, there is change in the sense that how the country is being run versus the past, but there is still that civilizational continuity. And I want your take on civilizational definition of nationalism, which is a very, I would say, and a very important narrative that is discussed a lot today, right, in the mainstream and also in the academia. What do you think of civilizational definition of a nation or a nation state?
So, on the continuity part and paganism, I think it has more to do with the similarities that you find in this and religion are, I think, valid in the sense that nationalism is also a way of social organizing a group of communities, and so is religion. And so, in early years, the when two groups were fighting off each other, it is their gods who won or lost before Judaism came. And this has to do. There's a very interesting history of why Judaism came, and it's precisely because of this. Because before Judaism, before monotheism, and early Judaism is not monotheism, it's monolatrism. Before that, it is when two it is not that they believe that every god is, there are false gods per se, but they believe that there are gods who are very powerful and there are gods who are not powerful. So if your group won, what it meant is that your god is more powerful than the other god. So what you're supposed to do is you worship the other god as sort of the defeated people, and you worship your own god as a subordinate of the other god. So this is how things were. So I understand where you see the similarities. And also there's the idea of the national myth. Every nation has its own myth, and that myth is not true in any of the nation. Is not true. So the Americans have the myth of American exceptionalism and the American dream. The Indians have the myth of what Perry Anderson calls the Indian ideology. So every nation has their own myth, which are not true, but which are essential stories about the nation as a group that the people imbibe in order to become, in order to feel as complete citizens, in order to feel proud that they belong to that group. Uh, and to your question on civilizational nationalism, I'm afraid I don't know what that exactly means. I've heard this term a lot. Jay Sai Deepak talks about it in his book, but I don't know specifically what it means. So if you could just tell me what it means.
Well, the fact that basically Indic civilization, which is rooted around dharmic values, right? Uh, uh, if you look at it from Indus Valley, so basically what it says is India as a, as a national identity, as a civilizational identity in that sense, has existed. It has started, like, historically. I mean, the earliest right now you could say is Indus Valley civilization, and whatever has happened thereafter, there has been continuity, and the Republic of India is one phase in an entire lifetime of this civilization. It doesn't accept the hypothesis that even though the political formation of the Indian nation state happens at 1947, or you could say some of it, like, during the colonial period, but 1947 is the time when it actually starts as an independent self-ruled country. uh, it is still one phase, the last phase or the latest phase in a larger chronology, rather than, oh, 1947 is the birth. That is, I think, the primary, it does not believe in that break from the past. It believes that this is one phase in a continued phenomenon. Like, that's the whole idea. And of course, it basically doesn't. Indic civilizationalism says that you can't really separate Hindu Hinduism in the sense that Hindu culture. I'm not talking of it just as a, like, not to be represented as a theocracy, but more in terms of, let's say, I mean, I'll give you a crude example. When you have missiles, right, or you have the names of missiles, or you have Satyameva Jayate, right, or you have the name of the missions that we launch, Mangalayan, these come from a certain Hindu cultural ethos. So, in that sense, even though United States also, for example, is a secular nation, right, by its own constitution, at the same time, it also, I mean, the people who take oath, they do take oath on the Bible. Like, in that sense, there is a certain cultural continuity and historical.
Not necessarily. They can choose not to.
They can choose not to, but most of them do. Many of them do, and that doesn't take away from the fact that, matlab, they believe in those certain foundations. Some people obviously talk about how there is Christian roots to, the American, like, the nation itself. There are, of course, arguments on this, but the point here is there is cultural continuity, there is civilizational continuity, and the Republic of India is not a modern day the India as a concept is not a modern day creation, even if the Republic of India starts in 1947. So it's that larger narrative that it focuses on.
So if you go by that, I don't know how. many, like it sounds to me more like an ideology as opposed to a descriptive definition. So Pakistan, even like people in Pakistan claim that Indus Valley civilization is theirs. They argue that these are the same people. Like they may have believed
Most of them,
in polytheism before that, but their argument is that these are the same, these
I
were our ancestor. It was our ancestors.
I
This is
no,
actually very
actually,
popular.
I'll have to refute that because from whatever multiple times that this has been seen, this could be a small minority, but largely I've seen association with Turkic people, Turkey. I've seen association with Persianate culture. I've seen association with Arabic culture as well. So they usually kind of claim that Mohammed bin Qasim is the starting point of the Pakistani nation, and they came as invaders, and that is where their identity is. And they've claimed multiple times Persianate origin, Arabic origin, Turkish origin. That's why Ertugrul is popular. What does it have to do anything with Pakistan? It has nothing to do with Pakistan, right? So this idea that they are claiming Panini or something like that, I don't think is a mainstream narrative. I don't think that is the case at all. In fact, it's quite to the contrary that they want to disassociate from that phase. They look at Muhammad bin Qasim. In fact, there is a book written by a guy called a historian called Manan. I'm forgetting. Basically, he's written saying that how Muhammad bin Qasim is the defining part. I mean, of course, you will easy. It's easy to make an argument that even that is not the defining start of Pakistan, right? In fact, in this case, it is actually a modern day creation. There is no mention of it in any textual or oral form at all. But yet, claims of these natures are, of course, made in the mainstream and in the academia as well. So, I think that is not something.
But even that is a civilizational claim. That is a civilization. It's not a civilizational claim for dharmic. It's a civilizational claim for the Islamic
Sure. I was
civilization.
defining,
So,
okay, so when I
so
said civilizational state, I was answering generally and then I was defining it in Indian terms, right? So, of course, Germans would have a different way of defining it. They would probably say they have a linguistic definition of it, right? So the point here is civilizational definition was one, and basically where you're saying there is continuity from the past through culture and through values. And here in Indian case, it is Indic civilizational nationalism. That's the argument I was making. Pakistan doesn't claim
But
that.
but your definition of Indic civilization may differ from other people's definition of what Indic civilization is. So, who defines what Indic civilization is, what Western civilization is? I mean, someone who's like white supremacist would say that this is Western civilization, and someone who's a standard
But that's an argument.
conservative
See,
American would have a
moral
different.
relativism is an argument you can make for everything.
I'm not making a moral
But
relativist
it is
argument.
right. Everybody has
I'm
their own
I'm
definition.
Yes,
That's moral
I'm making
relativism.
an argument. No, I'm not saying. I'm saying that who makes the right definition. I'm not saying that whether this definition is correct or not. There may be a correct or wrong definition of Western civilization, but who defines that? Who gets to define that?
The larger society, the people who constitute that nation.
In what way?
In what way? In the sense, I mean,
Like what is the index civilization?
my question here is so, like I said, this is what I was talking about from what the index side usually says, right? This is what they say that this is how they define the civilization, and the Republic of India is a phase. Now there is the other side which says that India is created only in 1947 or it is only created during colonial rule post 1857, whatever it is. That's the Indian matlab, those are two and probably not the only narratives based on which you define that. My question here was firstly, generally, what do you think of the civilizational definition? And you seem to not agree with the definition of Indic civilization defining India as a nation. So, uh, what do you think is the alternative to that if you disagree on that?
No, I don't. I neither disagree nor agree because I don't have a precise definition of what it means. But if I just look at history, if I look at the way in which nationalism has been defended by our founding fathers or freedom fighters, like Gandhi or Tagore, not Tagore, Nehru, or all of these figures, or even Savarkar, was that so in Hind Swaraj, the way in which Gandhi defines nationalism is because he's arguing precisely against this. He's precisely saying that India has existed as a nation before the British arrived at India.
Correct.
It's not the British who gave us
Absolutely.
our identity or whatever. And he cites the Char Dhams as an example of that.
Sacred geography. Yeah.
Sacred geography. So I think that is an interesting way to look at it. And I do think that history plays a crucial role in defining our identity. And I think that our identity is shaped by our geographical location and historical events over which we may or may not have any control over. So I think history plays an important uh, role. I think people imagine themselves as being part of India before the British came in. I think there was an identity that existed before the British. Uh, it may not have been as rigid as it became after the arrival of the nation state, but it existed just as it existed in, say, the United States
Yeah.
or Russia. You know, the Russians have always thought of, they've been proud to be Russians. Or, for instance, Ukrainians, like they have a history of Ukrainian nationhood that dates back long before even Russia was on the scene. Before Moscow was on the scene, there was Kiev.
Right. So yeah, I mean that's a very. I mean, so in a way, you kind of agree to this part that only a constitution or a book cannot help in creating at least a sustainable nation. It is too rational. It is not the way in which human beings work together, right? So I think
People are not rational.
yeah, exactly. So, I mean, that itself is quite a thing, I mean, to say, because, of course, the usual liberal argument is constitutional patriotism. So, I think that is definitely a meeting ground in my view, that itself. And so, what else do you think, what are the other areas in which you think the people who are nationalists and those who are liberals or left liberals, uh, what other places can they find meeting grounds and reconcile so that in some ways they can work together?
I think in today's world, they would agree on a lot of issues, uh, but in India we don't have debate on policies. We have debate on who's the hero and who's the villain and all of that. Historically speaking, uh, I think when it comes to values, a lot of the so-called Indic values that the Upanishads or the Mahabharata, uh, Arindam Chakravarti has written a lot about it. So all of these values, a lot of them are actually quite synonymous, compatible, and even in favor of liberalism. Even Amartya Sen has written about it. He calls himself a Hindu atheist. He calls himself a Charvaka. Uh, and he defends his idea of justice through references to classical Indian texts. So people can find the meeting ground if they search for it, but the problem in today's world is we're so polarized that we're not willing to look at the other side at all. So everything that comes from Hinduism becomes a sort of Brahminical patriarchy things, which is supposed to be only deconstructed and not looked upon as something that holds values. That is complete nonsense. In fact, the best defense for moral realism comes from the Mahabharata. It has it gives the defense of moral realism in the sense of moral dilemmas, which Chakravarti again has written about. And
Can you elaborate that
this
a little?
so Chakravarti argues that the moral dilemma, because in the Mahabharata, Arjuna has the moral dilemma of whether he's supposed to, uh, you know, kill his
Yeah.
relatives, or do his duty as a Kshatriya, or stay silent. And all of these, the sense in which the Mahabharata interprets morality is in the sense of these dilemmas, which is not to say that there is something absolutely moral, like there's a moral principle that you can name, but there's a moral principle that you should strive to, which is better than the other moral principles. And it is that through these dilemmas, the one which fits the context uh, better than the other is the one which is morally superior, is the one which is dharmic. So this is the argument that someone like Arindam Chakravarti makes. So I do think that there are or for instance Devi Prasad Chattopadhyay, he has written a tome, and he was a Marxist, like he was a Leninist, not even like an old school Marxist, a Leninist, but also a Sanskrit scholar. And he wrote a tome of a book which is Science and Technology in Ancient India, showing that ancient India had a rich tradition of science and technology, but that is, will a someone who is belongs to the Indic perspective is not going to touch that, because he's going to be repulsed by the fact that this argument is made by a Marxist. So there's a Marxist lens there. So let's not go there. So because of these polarization, it's harder for us to come at a reconciliation, at a common ground. But the common ground, factually speaking, exists, and it's time now more than ever for us to find it.
Interesting. In fact, there is this person called Satya Bhakta who was part of the Communist Party, and he argues for a communist Ram Rajya. I don't know. I mean, it's kind of interesting because those two things have never been put together. At least, like, people don't conceive those two things together. But I mean, he's quite detailed in terms of his hypothesis in this regard. So, I mean, but anyways, yeah. So I think the one area that you people could look at is that read all sides, make your own opinion, and even on the other side, probably you might, even if there is a very heavy bias, maybe there might be some nuggets of information that might be good to
Yeah.
take.
Focus on the information, uh, disagree or agree with the interpretation.
Yeah, correct. That's a good way of looking at it. The other thing that I want to kind of, in the second part of this conversation, that I want to kind of talk about is, because it's an extension of this topic, but in a one specific area, which is the social sciences, because this is the area where there is maximum difference of opinion amongst the left liberals and the nationalists, because one side thinks that, oh, it's all that the social sciences have become a monopoly of the left, and the other side is trying to kind of find alternative ways through which it can make its own point of view. And certain exceptional cases, of course, do emerge in the social science field even from the nationalist side, but again, rare and like they are a minority and an exception. So why do you think, like, again, from a historical perspective, how did the social sciences actually become left liberal? Were they from their very conception left liberal, or at some point, because I have read about cultural Marxism, Gramsci, as well as the Frankfurt School. I mean, but I still want to know the historical trajectory, and for the viewers' benefit as well. How did that kind of happen?
How are we defining social sciences, though? How far are we going?
Since the time they would be in the academic sphere, so yeah, in modern history, at least I see the last 100 years. Obviously, the study, the social science, the field exists much longer than that. So, but in a systematic academic fashion, you know, subjects.
There is no doubt, and I don't think anyone has any doubts to the fact that social sciences are predominantly left or liberal or libertarian in the American sense. But the conservatives are not the ones who are doing the intellectual job. And I think the reason for that, it cannot be reduced to ideological echo chambers. That plays a crucial role, and we can talk about how it plays out and everything. But it's also there's a psychological reason for it, which is that the people uh, who are Jonathan Haidt has done a lot of research on this. The social psychologist. Uh, I think he's at Maxwell School, University of Chicago. Might be wrong on that. So in the righteous mind, he writes about the conservative impulse versus the other impulse. So there are five traits in psychology. If we have to talk, to classify the big five, which are most famous: conscientiousness, extraversion, neuroticism, openness to experience, and orderliness, something like that. So conservatives are more likely to be conscientious, they're more likely to be orderly, and they're less likely to be high in openness to experience. And that plays a crucial role in uh, predicting the kind of jobs that they're going to do. And these traits are fairly stable throughout one's lifetime. So the kind of jobs that conservatives go to is engineering, or
B school,
yeah, a B school, business,
medicine, law.
medicine, corporate, because you have a corporate leader. Like, it's hard for a liberal to become a corporate CEO. Maybe libertarian because of lack of disgusting, because of because liberals are less more open in discuss sensitivity. But a, a corporate job essentially demands you to be cruel to people, and it also asks, a lot of corporate jobs also asks that you have minimum contact with people. You're supposed to just be there, and that is not a job that someone who's high and open to experience, and someone who's disorderly, as a lot of liberals are, and someone who's high in neuroticism, uh, which makes you more prone to mental disorders, clinical depression, and things like that. So if all of these traits do not, they clearly don't predict you to have a good time in corporate jobs. So there are certain, so that division of jobs depends partly on these psychological traits. And so we have evidence for this. We have evidence for who is more likely to be a conservative versus a liberal versus a libertarian, and libertarians are a different beat
Yeah.
altogether. So because they have no disgust sensitivity. It's like they're not disgusted by anything at all, which is a very the far anarcho-capitalist libertarians. The disgust sensitivity is extremely low. So, in that sense, I think it is natural that people who do the creative work, people who write, people who make movies, are going to be people who are also liberal primarily. So the psychological reason is one that I think is overlooked, but is very, very crucial.
Okay, that's a interesting way of looking at it. But would you say that it's a gradient of many reasons, and this is one important one,
Yes,
right?
yes.
What do you see the contribution of cultural Marxism as well as the Frankfurt School on this?
Very little, very little.
Really?
Yes, very little.
Could
Because,
you kind of give a background to the viewers what these two things are and why then are they very.
first of all, I don't use the term culture Marxist because the people who are labeled as culture Marxist never use the
Yeah, sure.
term culture Marxist. And a lot of them, because there are also a diverse variety of thinkers. Like there's Eric Hobsbawm, and then there's Horkheimer, and then there's Adorno, and then there's Ernest Kellner, and all of these people. There's also Piaget. I think all of these people disagreed with each other a lot. Like they had very little meeting grounds, and often their focus was different. Like Hobsbawm was obviously very sympathetic to Marxism. Horkheimer and Adorno were extremely critical, as were a lot of other Frankfurt theorists, extremely critical of uh, the Soviet Union, and they wrote a lot about criticizing the Soviet Union and criticizing a lot of Marxist authoritarianism that was happening around. They were fervently against totalitarianism. And then there are also people also add on the later postmodernist, which is Foucault and Derrida. And again, Foucault and Derrida disagreed with each other a lot, and Derrida is much harder to read than Foucault, with its a very important distinction. And Derrida focuses on language. Like there are readings of Derrida which are conservative. Like lots of conservatives have written about Derrida. I'm forgetting his name, but he was a Catholic father who wrote an excellent book on Derrida, and he had a long association with Derrida, basically arguing for a conservative reading of Derrida, how to read Derrida as a conservative. And Derrida was also part of the Janhurst Foundation with Roger Scruton, the conservative
Oh.
intellectual, funded by the Murdochs and George Soros to fight against the communism in Czechoslovakia. He was arrested for that. So these were not your traditional leftist figure. And Foucault was like Foucault, I think, once argued that Marxism is like a fish out of water. It may have made sense in another time, it doesn't make sense now. So it has no value now. That was essentially Foucault's claim. So I'm not sure that the only thing that Foucault and Derrida did is they made social science more convoluted than it needed to be,
Oh,
and they were
can you expand on that?
Derrida
Can you?
primarily, not Foucault, Derrida, because Foucault actually is a historian. I mean, he writes on history, and you can read him. You can read him, and it's interesting reading. And there are a lot of good points when you read
Yeah.
Foucault as
But
well.
why do you say
But Derrida,
convoluted? There, yeah. What's the
it's because it's convoluted, because Derrida is convoluted, and
what exactly? What
Alan.
exactly? Why do you say that? What makes you say?
So Alan Sokal did an excellent paper,
The
where he
Sokal affair. Can
exposed,
you talk about that? Yeah.
yeah, the Sokal affair, where he exposed, because there were a lot of these people originating from that school, not Derrida particularly, who were arguing about how mathematics or physics, or the Principia Mathematica is a rape manual. One of them literally argued that the Principia Mathematica is a rape manual, and they knew Lacan. Lacan wrote a lot on mathematics, and he knew no mathematics. So he was not a trained mathematician, and he was it was like he was making it more difficult for his writings to be accessible. These are not working class philosophers. These are philosophers who are sitting on their high horse and making things more complex than they need to be. They're the stereotypical academics. So they had an influence on some fields. English literature, in particular, suffered a lot. uh, I do think there's a lot of value in Derrida, by the way, not so much in Lacan, but Derrida and Foucault, I think, should obviously feature. But English literature is now, if you go through English literature, it's mostly post-structural thinking. It's mostly the ideas of Derrida and Foucault and Judith Butler and all of these figures who, when you like, that's not why someone wants to learn English literature. I don't want to learn English literature to know about, gender trouble of Judith Butler. I want to learn English literature because I want to appreciate the works of Marlowe and Shakespeare and James
The
Joyce and all
aesthetic.
of these
Yeah.
figures, the aesthetic part. Roger Scruton like he was an aesthetic philosopher. He loved the aesthetic, and he defended the aesthetic as something that just needed to exist. It didn't have to be utilitarian. So that utilitarian reasoning also has an important role to play, because everything now has to have a purpose. Like, why do you want to like, it has to have material
Yeah, yeah,
gains.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Like, when you do that, obviously it's going to be politicized. Obviously it's going to be about what's happening around you versus, the aesthetic value of the work of art.
A lot of artists, okay, now they have this thinking. Some of them say that art should have the freedom to express what it needs to, whether it's a painting or a written work or a movie, uh, including political ideas, right? It can be an instrument to express political ideas in a very creative form. The other thing, line of thinking is art is the purpose in itself. Creating art itself is a purpose. You don't need to add anything on top of that, and it's not supposed
Hmm.
to, like, a painting is just that, a painting. It doesn't have to become an
Yes.
instrument of political expression. So where do you stand on, I mean, this, like,
Well, it can be an instrument of political expression, but it has to be an art first.
uh
Like, you can add components of it. Like, if there's a story in your mind that has political, like, parts in it, they can be there. But you don't make art to justify your political leanings. An art has to stand because of its own value, as a story, as a narrative, as a painting, as a music. It has to stand on its own, not on the value that it promotes per se. And guess who was the guy who predicted this would happen, that this was happening? It was Adorno and Horkheimer, in the dialectic of enlightenment, which they called enlightenment as mass deception. So Adorno and Horkheimer claim that there is a culture industry which works based on these utilitarian principles, and it produces repetitions. Basically, it produces what you want to, just watch and relax, and what you're familiar with. So it's afraid of the unknown. It does not let you do the unfamiliar because of corporatization. And you can clearly see that with the sort of animated movies that come out, the bad ones. So there was an emoji movie, for instance. Awful movie, but it made money. It made money. There was the Marvel superhero comics, which are basically one story repeated with slight aesthetic modifications. But people watch that because large corporations are producing that, and that affects directors from creating new characters, new stories, entering the unfamiliar age, which Kubrick or Satyajit Ray or Steven Spielberg or the French New Wave would have done, because they did not have the studio system dictating what they're supposed to do. So it is the culture industry, in other words, which forces people to make art, not to express themselves, which is what art is supposed to be an expression of the mindset you create, but to appease the sentiments of the masses and to ensure that it makes the most money.
Okay, interesting. And also wokeism, right? Although it's a left liberal movement, it seems to mesh with capitalism. It's the it's actually in the sense that the capitalists have adopted wokeism with the veneer of social sciences. Do you think of it that way, or what do you think about wokeism in this sense?
The best opponents of wokeism that I've read are not conservatives. They're Marxists, most of them, and leftist. They're people like Gabriel Rockhill, Slavoj Žižek. Um, these figures who point out that wokeism is a distraction from real issues. It's not like your gender pronouns are not the issues that most people are worried about. It's an issue that only the elites are worried about. But it has to like become this huge thing. So identity politics centrally, I think, is antithetical to the left, and it walks well together with the left. Uh,
But you do realize
Ibram
that
X.
even, I
Kendi.
mean, although you're saying it's antithetical, it's
Yeah.
been,
Well, it is
it is, but
antithetical.
it
It is
is,
if you read critical race theories, they're not
yeah, yeah,
leftists.
yeah.
Most of them are
Yeah, 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 but
liberals.
it's
They're
co-opted pretty
explicitly liberal.
much. I mean, to the extent that now it's,
But also the worst form of it is co-opted. The argument that someone like Delgado made, the early critical race theorist, someone like Charles Mills, the racial contract, brilliant arguments. Like whether you agree or disagree, this is something that is done with the intention to provoke and to make you think and to make you argue. Like it's a rational argument. And Charles Mills was a critical race theorist, but he was also a liberal. He wanted to defend Kant from his racism, in the sense that he wanted to ensure a form of liberalism that was not the Kantian liberalism which was espoused in the values of racism. He wanted to create an anti-racist liberalism, which is a worthy endeavor. And the racial contract is a brilliant book that I think everyone should read. But the intellectuals that we have today, people like Robin DiAngelo, people like Ibram X. Kendi, the some of one of the Ibram X. Kendi's work was decent, but after the how to be an anti-racist, he's gone off the entire track. And you find these people never debate. Ibram X. Kendi will never debate someone who disagrees with him. Robin DiAngelo will never debate anyone who disagrees with her. But she'll charge like billions of dollars for her DIY session, diversity and inclusion training session. And it pays. And that's why people go into it. That's why, because the HR gives it attention.
yeah.
So these people, these are their livelihood, and they don't want their livelihood attacked, and it results in awful it like canceling is one part of it, but also loss of livelihood. And Rupa Subramanya has a recent piece out on how a school educator who was a liberal educator opposed slightly one of the claims that the DIY trainer was making, and he was harassed and put out, and eventually he had to commit suicide because he was pushed to that length. He lost his reputation and he had to commit suicide. And this is a liberal Canadian person. Like all he said, like, was that United States is worse than Canada. And it's like, then the pylon happened, and that was considered to be white supremacy, and all of it. Like, that is literally all he said, and for which he lost his well-earned career, reputation, and had to commit suicide. So this woke capitalism is a danger, that not just to decency, not just to human beings, but also to actual leftism, also to actual liberalism. So I think every sane person should be opposed to this.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think there are more left liberal voices which are now, I would say, still not enough. There can be many more, but there are a few voices like that that have emerged that do criticize wokeism in a very rational way. And I'm sure you've also heard Kennedy speak about, when, I mean, as a presidential candidate, even he has spoken quite a bit about the old school liberal values than what is now, I mean, in a way, neoliberalism, not in the way that the left defines it, but I mean, when I say neoliberalism, in the sense that wokeism is becoming that. So there are a lot of old school left liberals who don't particularly agree. I know for a fact that there are a lot of previous generations of feminists who don't agree with current generation of feminists, right? I mean, the first, second, third generation of feminists might not agree with the latter day, descendants of that
Yeah,
movement. So, I mean, there are, but I still think that there can be more vociferous opposition from their side, because I think that will carry greater heft, because you do expect the other ideology to
yeah.
oppose. That is obviously expected. But when that comes from the left, the left liberals, the old school left liberals, I think it will carry greater heft and also make it easier to kind of discredit these movements in some ways.
But it also has to do with priorities. Like, I don't think wokeism is an issue in India.
It isn't. In
It may
India,
be
it
an
isn't.
issue
It's an
like in,
international thing. Yeah. The problem, is not that it is not an issue in India. The problem is that these things tend to come into India. Like, if you're not prepared, America is like, whether you like it or not, I mean, I know it's a self perception for a lot of Americans that it's the center of the universe, but because of the economic and cultural heft it has, things do get exported from there. Things do come from there. So,
but we are like developing third world country. Like, there's no way that most of our people are going to like pay for diversity and
yeah, yeah, of
inclusion
course.
trainings
It's
in
a
the
it's a
near
very
future.
first world pre.
It's not.
Also, don't you?
It's a first
It's a
world.
first world preoccupation, that too of the elites, and also, don't you think in some.
And the only one who are woke in India are the elites. They're the people who are studying at Asoka Engineering.
I mean, it seriously is, right? I mean, in a way, it's sociologically, it's also been defined that people without any real causes or real difficulties make up these causes to create new meaning to their lives in some ways, to find meaning. So,
Yeah, it's also because they have not seen the world enough. They have not experienced enough difficulties or problems. Have not been to uh, real India, or just middle class India. I don't think they realize what middle class India is. Even people like in JNU, because they have attained that upward mobility. So it's like we have been divided into spheres. So you only associate with people who belong to your class, and when you go to upper class, so like upper class will not associate themselves with upper middle class, and the elite after that will not associate themselves with the elite below. And like this, Sanjay Baru mentions this in his book India's Power Elite. He writes about how he was granted temporary membership of the Delhi Gymkhana Club when he was in Prime Minister Manmohan Singh's cabinet, but the movement he left, that was revoked. So even someone like Sanjay Baru, who's like up there, is not an elite. Like he may be an elite in his state, he's not an elite in Delhi. So
Temporary elite. Yeah.
we have differing conceptions of the elite
Yeah, but
and the divisions are.
to be very honest, I don't think any society can exist without elites. It's just I think the question probably is the way in which the elites are constituted, because you would need a smaller set of people, even in a communist society which claims to be very egalitarian and all that. The Politburo is the elite. I mean, it has its own definition of an elite, right? If you are a card carrying member, there are certain benefits you get. So, I mean, it's just the way you craft the elite, but I think it's almost impossible to not have, like, all equality in a way, in that sense, is a myth, because there'll always be some people who are benefiting in a certain system more than the others. That is,
And I don't think there's anything wrong with being elite or being wanting to
there
be elite.
isn't,
Like I would love to be elite, but look,
like, there's
the
nothing
problem
wrong, but
is
it's
when
just I would say that what is more important is how is that elite constituted, rather than whether there
yes,
is an elite
yes.
or not.
And in India, it's mostly generational wealth. It's mostly that. It's mostly your family.
Correct, correct. It is the embryo decides elitism. So yeah. So last couple of things I want to ask you. One is, how can alternative movements emerge in social sciences? Just as a social science student who wants to see quote unquote diversity for the joy of the social science, so that not for from the perspective of just diversity, but to understand a different lens in the same subject. How can alternative non left movements emerge in this academic space?
Well, it can certainly not emerge in the way that this government wants it to emerge, which is that you put few people on these high societies, whether it's the Prime Minister Memorial or JNU or these universities, and you do it disrupts it. Like you put the old guard out, and then there's a new
So
guard.
how do
Like this
you
is not
so
how
how
it's
do
going
you
to work.
think,
This is
if that's a problem, then how do you think it should emerge?
It has to come from culture. It has to come from an acceptance in the cultural sense that there are views that I disagree. And look, we've had right-wing historians who were respected by the left, who are still cited by the left, like Jadungar Sarkar. And we continue, like, there is a lot of intimidation going on right now with this government, particularly when it comes to academia, and I don't think that is the right way. It's or that it's fair. It's simply uh, an infringement on academic freedom. What the government needs to do is create, well, first, I believe in the patronage system. So I think some artists, no matter whatever uh, political views they belong to, should be patronized by the state so that they produce good art. That's the time when we produce the best art. Like look at uh, look at the way in which Ustad Bismillah Khan died, like in penury. Look at the way in which his descendants are living, who are going on and continuing that culture of preserving tradition and music. They're not being given enough support by the state, and they should be, because it's your culture and it's the responsibility of the state to promote its own culture. So artists like that, a great artist, should be patronized by the state, and not for political reasons, but because they're great artists, because the world will get to witness more of that great art. Second, I think that in the universities, the academia will also have to be more open, because I do think that in some sense the academia is living in its own high horse, and it's looking down upon the other people who are doing research that may not completely align with their views. They look down upon public intellectuals, Why should anyone look down upon public intellectuals out of I have no idea about it. So you just like they just want to sit there and write their own thesis and just have their own like no, get your research out, because the aim of social science, the aim of a lot of this policy research and a lot of the philosophical literature is because you want more people to believe in your idea of the common good. So get it out in simplistic, accessible format. That is not something that you should look down upon. And you don't have to pedestrianize this. Like, people are not dumb. Just explain to them in simple terms. So, public intellectuals, I think, will play a huge role, will have to play a huge role in moderating our level of discourse. But there must be rigorous public intellectuals. They cannot be, boycotted one side or the other side of public intellectuals. They have to be intellectually rigorous. And I don't care about the political views, honestly. They can lean to any side as long as they're intellectual rigorous and they're getting their ideas out to people. We will create that culture where we reward good research and good science.
Interesting. So, just one last thing, which is, do you think, because social sciences are so subjective, right? Do you think adding more quantitative methods, statistical analysis to arrive at conclusions to increase the level of objectivity in the social sciences uh, can also be an area that could be, that's an area that is worth looking at?
Yeah, and it's happening. It's happening in the university that I study in. It's happening in the private universities in this area. It's not happening in government universities.
Wow.
So the curriculum in government universities seems to be awfully outdated in every social science field. Like, the psychology curriculum is probably 20 years outdated. So what we need to do at this point, we don't have enough teachers, first of all, in the government institutes. We need to have more government public funded institutes of better quality with better researchers. Plus, I think it is an important part, and it's happening slowly. I was happy to see Nalin Mehta's recent book, which is based
Yeah.
almost entirely on statistical analysis. Rahul Verma and Pradeep Chipper at Asoka has done brilliant work on based on statistical analysis. Milan Vaishnav. So it's happening, but at a slower pace than we'd like it to happen. And it's definitely not happening in our public universities. So the government needs to incentivize that. The government needs to incentivize archaeological research. 100 kilometers away from Sonipat, we have Rakhi Gadi,
Hmm.
which is the biggest place of the Indus Valley civilization. 90% of it is not excavated.
Wow.
Nine almost there are This is just one place. This entirely, if you like count, there's like thousands of places which are just not excavated at all. They are neglected, and the buildings are being built over them. We are destroying our own heritage. We are not funding enough research, and the government needs to prioritize this, not just talk about history in the political sense of the term, but actually fund research to excavate these places, our rich heritage, to do statistical training, fund public universities. And the moment you do this, you will have a more rigorous social sciences, and you will also have a more rigorous just normal sciences.
Absolutely. A very good discussion, a very balanced one, which is a rarity with these subjects. It was a lot of fun. For me, Anvesh, to have this chat with you. I hope it was the same for you as well.
Yes, yes, I loved it. I love talking to you.
Absolutely, guys. Do please share your comments on what you thought about this episode. Until next time, I will sign off. Thank you.